Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Come in out of the cold, and let me take that weight off you before we begin. There is nothing you need to do tonight, nowhere you need to be, no thought you need to finish. You have carried enough today, whatever it was, and now you can set it down at the edge of the bed the way you set down a heavy bag by the door. Feel free to let me know, sometime, what time it is where you are and what corner of the world you are listening from. I like to imagine you there, the lamp low, the room quiet, the day finally behind you. Take a slow, deep breath with me now. In and out. Let your shoulders drop a little further than you think they can. Let the pillow hold the full weight of your head. There is a story tonight, an old and strange and true one, and it does not ask anything of you. You do not have to remember it. You do not have to understand every part. You can drift off in the middle and come back, or drift off and not come back at all, and that is perfectly all right. The story will keep. Grandpa will still be here. Let us begin. I want to tell you tonight about a man who helped build the very idea of the atom and who kept, in secret, a diary of more than 1,000 dreams. 1,000. Think of that for a moment, slowly, the way you would turn a smooth stone over in your hand. Here was one of the sharpest, coldest, most exacting minds of the whole 20th century. A man who lived among numbers and equations the way you and I live among tables and chairs, and every night, or many nights, he wrote down what came to him in the dark. Not measurements, not calculations, dreams, birds and circles and strange machines, colours and figures and rooms that do not exist. And then, stranger still, he handed those dreams to a psychologist. And let that psychologist choose 400 of them and publish them in a real book, printed and bound and sold for anyone to read. And the astonishing part, the part I want you to hold gently as you fall asleep, is this. His name was not on any of it. For years, the man in that book was called nothing more than a young man of scientific education. A scientist of international reputation, the pages said, and nothing more. Readers turned those pages never knowing that the anonymous dreamer, the man whose sleeping mind they were peering into, was one of the founders of quantum physics itself. A giant hiding in plain sight inside a book of his own dreams. His name was Wolfgang Pauli. Wolfgang Ernst Pauli, to say it in full, and we will come back to that middle name in a moment, because there is a small and lovely thing hidden inside it. He was born in the year 1900, right at the turn of the century, and he died in 1958. Not a long life, as lives go. 58 years. But into those years he packed enough discovery to fill several ordinary lifetimes and enough private turmoil to nearly break him more than once. He was, by every account we have, a difficult man. Brilliant in a way that could be cruel. He had a tongue like a blade, and he used it on other physicists without mercy, tearing their sloppy ideas to ribbons. There is a famous thing he is supposed to have said about a piece of work so muddled, so confused, that it was not even good enough to be called wrong. Not even wrong. That was Pauli. He did not suffer foolishness, not in others and not in himself. And yet this same man, this scalpel of a mind, would spend the second half of his life reaching toward something that no equation could hold. But I am getting ahead of the story, and tonight there is no hurry at all. Let us go back and walk slowly. Let me tell you first what Pauli did in physics, so you understand just how large a figure we are talking about before he ever knocked on a psychologist's door. Because to feel the strangeness of the dreams, you have to first feel the hardness of the man. In 1925, when he was only 25 years old, Pauli worked out something now called the exclusion principle. I will explain it the way I would explain it across the kitchen table, slowly, because the idea itself is beautiful once you see it plainly. Imagine the tiniest pieces of matter, the little specks called electrons that swarm around the heart of every atom. Now, an atom is a bit like a great theatre, and around its centre there are seats, arranged in rings, closer seats and farther seats. What Pauli discovered was a rule, a strict rule, almost like a law of good manners for these electrons. No two of them are allowed to sit in exactly the same seat, in exactly the same state, at the same time. Each electron must have its own place. No crowding. No two identical. That is the exclusion principle. It sounds like a small and fussy thing, does it not? A rule about seating. But hold it gently and see how large it truly is. Because it is that very rule, that refusal of two electrons to share one seat, that forces them to spread out into their rings, ring after ring, and it is that spreading out that gives every kind of atom its own particular character. It is why gold is gold and not lead. It is why the whole great table of the elements, the one that hangs on the wall of every schoolroom, is shaped the way it is. Matter itself is built on that quiet rule of no two the same. Without it, everything would collapse inward into a single grey sameness. So you see, this was not some minor footnote of a discovery. Pauli had found one of the hidden struts holding up the ordinary world. For that, many years later, in 1945, he was given the Nobel Prize in Physics, the highest honour his field can bestow. And it is a small, warm detail, worth holding on to, that the letter nominating him for that prize was written by Albert Einstein. Einstein himself put Pauli's name forward, one giant tipping his hat to another. There is a second thing Pauli did, and I love this one especially, because it tells you something about the shape of his mind, about how comfortable he was believing in things he could not see. In December of 1930, he was wrestling with a puzzle that troubled many physicists. When certain atoms broke apart in a particular way, a process with a long name we need not worry about, something seemed to go missing. A little bit of energy simply vanished from the ledger, and in physics, energy is not allowed to vanish. The books must balance. It is like counting the coins in and the coins out of a shop at the end of the day, and finding, every single day, that a few pennies are gone with no explanation. Now, most people, faced with missing pennies, would assume they had miscounted, or that a thief was about. But Pauli made a bolder guess. He proposed that the energy was not missing at all. It was being carried away by a tiny, ghostly particle that nobody had ever detected. A particle so faint, so shy, so nearly nothing, that it could pass through the whole solid earth as easily as you or I walk through an open doorway. He announced this idea in a letter, and the letter itself is a delightful thing. It began, "Dear radioactive ladies and gentlemen." He was almost apologizing, half joking, for suggesting a particle that no experiment could yet catch. That little ghost was later given a name by another physicist, Fermi. It was called the neutrino, which means, roughly, the little neutral one. And here is the part that makes me smile every time. Pauli proposed that invisible particle in 1930. It was not actually caught, not directly detected by any experiment until 1956. 26 years later, 26 years of the neutrino being real but unseen, believed in on the strength of a balanced ledger and a bold guess. And Pauli lived just long enough to hear the news that it had been found, for he died only 2 years after, in 1958. Hold that thought softly, because it will echo later tonight. A man perfectly at ease, believing in something invisible, something real but hidden, for a quarter of a century on faith and reason alone. That was Pauli's gift, and perhaps his fate. Now the middle name. Wolfgang Ernst Pauli. That Ernst was not chosen at random. Pauli's godfather, the man who stood beside him as a baby, was the great physicist and philosopher Ernst Mach. Mach was a famous and rather severe thinker, a man who believed science should concern itself only with what could be measured and observed, and should throw out everything else as so much fog and superstition. So little Wolfgang was, in a sense, dedicated at his christening to the hardest, most no-nonsense kind of science there is. His very name carried the expectation. Measure it, or say nothing about it. And is that not the most fitting thing, when you know where the story is going? The godson of the strictest measure-only philosopher of his age would grow up to keep a diary of 1,000 dreams and go searching for a bridge between the mind and the stars. But we are not there yet, not nearly. Let us stay a while longer with the young professor at the height of his powers. By this time in his life, Pauli was settled in the city of Zurich, in Switzerland, where he held the chair of theoretical physics at a great and famous institution, the one known as ETH Zurich, from 1928 onward. Picture that city for a moment as we go. Zurich, on its long clean lake, ringed by hills, the church bells sounding the hours across the water, the trams humming through tidy streets in the cold. It is a small detail, this city, but it matters more than you might think, and I will tell you why in a little while. For now, simply hold it. Pauli, professor at ETH Zurich, lecturing to students, corresponding with the greatest minds in Europe, feared and respected in equal measure. From the outside, a man at the summit, a Nobel winner in waiting, a builder of the new physics, comfortable, established, brilliant from the outside. But you and I both know, do we not, that the outside of a life and the inside of a life can be two very different countries. And inside, in these very years, Wolfgang Pauli was quietly coming apart. Let us slow down now, and be gentle here, because this is where the story turns from the public triumphs to the private wounds, and the private wounds are the reason the whole rest of the tale exists. It is often the case, is it not, that the deepest turns in a life come not from what we build, but from what we lose. So let us walk carefully into what Pauli lost. The first and heaviest loss came in 1927. Pauli's mother, a woman named Bertha Camillus, died, and she did not die of illness or old age or accident. She took her own life by poison. Sit with that for only a moment, softly, the way you would sit with a friend who has had bad news, not fixing anything, just being near. His mother, gone by her own hand, in 1927. Pauli was in his 20s, at the very height of his rising fame in physics, and beneath the equations and the lectures there was now this: a grief with no bottom to it. A wound of the kind that does not close, only quiets, and even then only sometimes. And to make the ground under him shakier still, his father, before very long, married again, a much younger woman. And by the accounts we have, Pauli resented the marriage deeply. So the home he had come from, the family shape he had grown inside, was broken and rearranged in a way that gave him no comfort at all. The mother gone, the father turned toward someone new, and the son left standing in the wreckage of it, holding his noble worthy mind and his unbearable heart, with no idea how to make the two of them speak to one another. Then came the second loss, close on the heels of the first, and though it was smaller than a death, it landed on a man already bruised. In December of 1929, Pauli married a woman named Kathia Deppner. Perhaps he hoped a marriage would steady him. Perhaps he hoped to build something new to stand on. But it was not to be. The marriage was unhappy almost from the start, and it did not last even a single year. Kotha left him, and she left him for another man, a chemist, which one imagines stung all the more sharply for a physicist, and they divorced in November of 1930. Less than 12 months from the wedding to the parting. Think of how that must have felt, layered on top of everything else. A man who could see the hidden order in all the matter of the universe, who could predict a particle nobody could find and be proven right, and who could not, for the life of him, hold together the ordinary happiness of one household. The great mind and the failing heart, pulling harder and harder against each other. And so, as so many wounded people do, Pauli reached for something to numb it. Through 1930 and into 1931, he was drinking. Heavily, he would go out into the nightlife of the city, into the cafes and the bars, and he drank more than a man should, and it made him quarrelsome and sharp-edged, and sometimes he got into fights. The brilliant, controlled professor of the daytime became, in the evenings, someone reckless and unhappy and half at war with himself. His work did not stop, mind you. He was still Pauli, still doing physics of the first rank. But a man can keep the outer machinery of his life running for a long time, while the inner rooms fall into darkness, one by one. And that is what was happening. Grief he had never grieved. Anger he could not place. A loneliness that no honour could fill. Somewhere in him he must have known that he could not go on like this, that the drinking and the quarrels were not the sickness, but only the fever, and that underneath there was something in him crying out that he did not have the language to answer. Now here is where the two halves of our story begin, at last, to lean toward one another. Because in that same city of Zurich, on those same tidy streets under those same church bells, there lived and worked another man. A man of an entirely different kind, whose whole life's labour happened to be exactly the sort of thing a drowning Pauli might need. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. And this is the great good fortune of geography I asked you to hold on to earlier. The reason the city mattered. Pauli, professor at ETH Zurich. Jung, working just there, in the same lakeside city. Had Pauli held his chair in Hamburg or Vienna or anywhere else on the map, the two of them might never have met. And the strange 26-year friendship we are going to follow, and the ideas that came out of it, might never have existed at all. But they were in the same place at the same time. One man cracking apart, and one man who had spent his whole career studying exactly what happens in the cracks. Sometimes the whole shape of a life turns on so small a thing as which city a man happens to teach in. I will tell you much more about Jung as the nights go on, but for tonight let me only set him gently in the doorway so you can see who it was that Pauli would eventually come to. Jung was a physician of the mind, what we would call a psychiatrist and psychologist, and he had built, over many years, his own distinctive way of understanding the human soul. He called it analytical psychology, and his great fascination, the thread that ran through everything he did, was the world beneath our waking thoughts, the deep hidden part of the mind that we do not choose and do not control. The part that speaks to us in dreams and symbols and strange, insistent images. He believed, and this was his boldest idea, that beneath each person's private memories there lay something even deeper and older, something shared by all human beings everywhere, a kind of inherited storehouse of images and patterns that he called the collective unconscious. We will unfold all of that slowly on another night. For now, simply know this. If ever there was a man whose life's work was suited to receive a flood of 1,000 dreams from a broken genius and to take those dreams utterly seriously, to treat them not as nonsense but as messages worth reading with the greatest care, it was Carl Gustav Jung, sitting in his study in Zurich, waiting, though he did not know it, for a physicist to arrive. And arrive he did. In January of 1932, Wolfgang Pauli, unable to carry himself any further alone, sought out Jung. Picture it if you like, softly, without drama. The dead of a Zurich winter. The lake grey and cold, the snow on the hills. A man in his early 30s, famous in his field and falling apart in his heart, making his way to the door of a psychologist because he has run out of every other road. It cannot have been an easy thing for a man like Pauli to do. Remember who he was, the sharpest tongue in physics, a skeptic to the bone, godson of the man who wanted to throw out everything that could not be measured. For such a man to admit that he needed help, that his brilliant mind could not save him, that the trouble was somewhere the equations could not reach, that was a surrender of a kind. And yet he made it. He went. Something in him was wise enough, even in the middle of the wreckage, to know that he could not think his way out of this, that he needed another kind of help, from another kind of man, who spoke another kind of language, the language of dreams and symbols rather than numbers and proofs. And so, in the cold of that January, the physicist knocked, and the door of the story swung open. Now you might imagine what happened next was the ordinary thing. The famous patient sits down with the famous doctor, and the doctor begins, week by week, to treat him, to analyze him, to guide him. That is what you would expect. That is what nearly anyone would have done. But Jung did not do the expected thing. Jung did something so careful, so subtle, so unlike ordinary practice, that when you understand it, you begin to see what kind of mind he too possessed, and what he chose to do in that moment would shape everything that followed. And it is exactly where we will pick up our story on the next night, when we look at the strange and deliberate decision Jung made, and why he refused, at first, to be Pauli's analyst at all. But before we leave off, let us gather back for a moment what we have held tonight, gently, without effort, the way you might gather a few smooth stones from a beach into your coat pocket, not to study them, just to carry the feel of them home. We have met Wolfgang Pauli, born in 1900, one of the founders of quantum physics, godson of the strict philosopher Ernst Mach. We have seen his exclusion principle from 1925, the quiet rule of no two electrons in the same seat that builds the whole variety of matter, the reason gold is gold and lead is lead. We have seen his Nobel Prize in 1945, with Einstein's own hand in the nomination. We have seen his little ghost of a particle, the neutrino, proposed in that letter to the dear radioactive ladies and gentlemen in 1930, believed in for 26 years before it was ever caught, in 1956. And we have seen the wounds beneath the honours, his mother Bertha, gone by her own hand in 1927. His father remarried to a woman he could not accept. His marriage to Kate the Depner begun in 1929 and ended in divorce by November of 1930, less than a year. The heavy drinking, the quarrels, the slow coming apart. And at last, in the January cold of 1932, the professor from Zurich, standing at the door of the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, in the same small lakeside city, ready to hand over the one thing his equations could never balance, which was himself. There is no rush now. You have carried the whole shape of it, and you do not need to keep hold of a single fact of it. Let it all soften. Let the names blur if they want to. Let the dates loosen and drift. The story is not a thing you must grip. It is a thing you can float upon, the way you would float on that grey Zurich lake in a warmer season, held up without any effort of your own, the sky wide above you, nothing to do but breathe. Wolfgang Pauli spent his whole life reaching for order beneath the surface of things, the hidden rule under the visible world. And tonight, all you need to do is let the surface of your own mind grow still, and trust that underneath it, without any work from you at all, sleep is already rising to meet you, faithful and quiet, the way the neutrino was faithful and real all those years before anyone could catch it. It is there. It is coming. You do not have to look for it. So breathe with me once more, slow and deep. In and out. Let the professor and his dreams stand quietly in the wings of your mind. We will meet them again and learn what Jung did next and why. For now there is only the lamp and the pillow and the weight of the day fully set down at last. Stay with me a little longer if you can, and we will go on together, gently, into the heart of the story. Let me tell you who he was, this man at the door, before we learn what happened when it opened. Because to understand why a person like Wolfgang Pauli would ever knock on a psychologist's door, you have to understand how little room there was, in a mind like his, for anything he could not measure. He was born in 1900, at the very turn of the century, and it was as though the century had marked him for the strange new physics it was about to invent. His godfather was a famous man, the physicist and philosopher Ernst Mach, and it was from Mach that the boy took his middle name. Imagine that. Before he could speak, before he could count, a great thinker had already bent over the cradle and lent him a name. And the child grew into exactly the kind of mind you might expect from such a beginning. Sharp, relentless, a little merciless, even with himself. By the time he was 25, Pauli had done the thing that would carry his name forever. He worked out a rule, a single quiet law, that no two electrons in an atom can ever occupy the very same state at the very same time. It sounds small. It is not small. That one rule is the reason matter holds its shape at all. It is the reason the elements line up the way they do. The reason the world is built of distinct and separate things instead of collapsing into a single grey sameness. Every stone, every leaf, every bone in your resting body keeps its form partly because of the rule a young man wrote down in 1925. They call it the exclusion principle. Years later, in 1945, they gave him the Nobel Prize in Physics for it, and the letter putting his name forward was written by Albert Einstein himself. Let that settle for a moment. Einstein saying, this one deserves it. And there was more. There was the invisible thing. In 1930, puzzling over an experiment that seemed to lose a little energy where no energy should be lost, Pauli did something almost reckless for so careful a man. He proposed a particle that nobody had ever seen. A ghost. something so faint, so shy of matter, that it could pass through the whole of the earth without touching a thing. He wrote it up in a letter that began, of all ways to begin, "Dear radioactive ladies and gentlemen." He was half apologizing for inventing something he could not prove. And here is the part to hold gently as you drift. That invisible particle, the neutrino, was real. It was there the whole time. But no one could catch it, no one could confirm it, for another 26 years. He had to simply trust that the unseen thing existed on the strength of the pattern alone, long before the world could show it to him. Keep that near you, because the man who could believe in the invisible neutrino was the same man about to be asked to believe in an invisible inner world. But a mind that brilliant is not the same as a life that is whole. And by his early 30s, Wolfgang Pauli's life was quietly coming apart. The order he could impose on the atom, he could not impose on his own days. The first blow had come in 1927. His mother, Bertha Camilla, took her own life by poison. Sit with how heavy that is, softly, from a safe distance, the way you would look at a hard thing through a window on a winter night. He was a young man, already famous, already brilliant, and his mother was simply gone, by her own hand, and no equation in the world could carry the weight of it. His father soon married again, a much younger woman, and the son resented it, and the family that had shaped him seemed to close like a door behind him. Then he reached for the ordinary comfort a person reaches for. He married. In the December of 1929, he wed a young woman named Keith the Depner. And it did not hold. She left him, for a chemist of all things, which must have stung a physicist in some small bitter way, and by the November of 1930 they were divorced. Less than a year. A marriage that lasted barely long enough to be called one. So there he was, not yet 31, and already he had buried his mother in the worst of ways, and watched a marriage dissolve almost before it began. A man can measure the atom and still not know what to do with a grief like that. And Pauli, who had always been sharp-tongued and quarrelsome, grew sharper. He drank. Not a glass by the fire, but heavily, the kind of drinking that goes looking for something and never finds it. He picked fights. He wandered the night streets of a city that could not help him. The most exact mind of his generation had come up against a problem that would not resolve, would not balance, would not yield to any clever rule, and the problem was himself, the one variable he could not solve for. Picture him in those months, if you can do it kindly. A brilliant, lonely man, the toast of the physics world by day, and something quite lost by night. Carrying a grief he had no language for, drinking to quiet a mind that would not quiet. He was, by every account, in real trouble. The kind of trouble that does not announce itself in headlines because, from the outside, he was still the great Professor Pauli. Only inside, where no colleague could see, the structure was failing. And so we come, slowly, back to that cold January of 1932, and to the decision that seems so strange for such a man. He did not go to another physicist. He did not go to a bottle again, or a lecture hall, or a chalkboard. He went instead to seek out a man who studied dreams. A man who believed that the images that rise in us at night are not nonsense, but messages. A hidden order beneath the surface of the mind, as real in its own way as any law of physics. Pauli did not yet know what he believed about any of that. He only knew that he could not go on as he was, and that whatever was broken in him lived somewhere his instruments could not reach. So he stood there in the winter cold, this Nobel-bound genius with the failing life. And he prepared to do the hardest thing a certain kind of proud, exact man can ever do. He knocked, and the door opened. Carl Gustav Jung was 56 years old in January of 1932. He was a large man, physically and otherwise, broad-shouldered, with glasses and a pipe, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades learning to sit with difficult things without flinching. He had built, over those decades, something he called analytical psychology. Not Freud's, not quite anyone else's, his own. He had been a student of Freud's once, a favourite student, in fact, the Crown Prince, some called him, the one who would carry the whole project forward. But they had quarrelled bitterly and finally, and by the 19-teens Jung had gone his own way. The break had cost him. There was a long period of interior darkness afterward, years of strange dreams and visions that he later described as a confrontation with the unconscious, something he had to walk through, carefully, the way you walk through a dark house you do not yet know, feeling for the walls. He came out the other side with ideas that were, even then, difficult to categorize. Too spiritual for the strictly clinical, too clinical for the strictly spiritual. He lived with that difficulty. He made it the center of his work. By the time Pauli came to him, Jung had been practicing and writing and thinking for nearly 4 decades. He had proposed the idea of the collective unconscious, the notion that beneath the personal layer of memory and feeling and wound, there was something older and wider, a deep stratum shared by all human beings, the way a river shares a bed with every drop of water that has ever run through it. He called the figures and patterns that lived in that deep stratum archetypes, not a metaphor exactly, and not a literal claim either, but something he spent his whole career trying to define precisely. Templates, perhaps inherited forms that the human psyche reaches for when it is looking for shape, for meaning, for a way to hold an experience too large for ordinary language. One of those forms was the mandala. The word is Sanskrit, and it means circle, though that simple translation leaves most of the weight out. Jung had noticed that people in deep psychological crisis, and people from dozens of cultures across thousands of years, spontaneously produced images of circles containing squares, or divided into 4, or arranged around a central point, as if the psyche were reaching instinctively for an image of order, of completeness. He had drawn them himself during his own difficult years, and he had come to believe that these images pointed to what he called the self, not the small everyday self, the name you use for yourself in a mirror, but the whole person, conscious and unconscious together. The totality that most of us spend our lives only partly inhabiting. To become more fully that totality, to move toward it consciously rather than being dragged by it unconsciously. That process he called individuation. A word that sounds technical but means, essentially, becoming who you actually are, all the way down. These were the waters Pauli had stepped into, or was about to step into. He did not know it yet. What happened next was not what Pauli expected, or perhaps he had no expectations. Perhaps a man in his state of crisis does not expect so much as hope, vaguely and desperately, that something will help. But whatever he expected, it was not this. Jung looked at him, assessed him, and then declined. Not unkindly, but firmly. He would not analyze Wolfgang Pauli himself. Let that land for a moment. Here was one of the most famous psychiatrists in Europe. Here was a brilliant, suffering man who had come to him specifically. And Jung said no. Not to the case, he was willing to take the case, but not to do the analysing himself. Not directly. Not yet. The reason was, in its own way, as careful as anything Pauli had ever done at a chalkboard. Jung was worried about contamination. The word he would have used might have been different, but the concept was the same one a physicist would recognise. He was worried that his own theories, his already developed, already published ideas about archetypes and the unconscious, would be too present in the room. That a man as intellectually acute as Pauli would, perhaps without meaning to, pick them up, would absorb them, would begin to dream in the very symbols Jung had already described and written about. And then what would those dreams prove? Nothing clean. The raw material would be compromised. Like a physics experiment in which the measuring instrument is affecting the thing it is supposed to measure. The term for that problem, in quantum mechanics, was something Pauli understood with total precision. He spent his life with it. The act of observation changes the observed. And Jung, in his own domain, was dealing with exactly the same difficulty. So he made a choice that is, the more you think about it, the more remarkable it becomes. He stepped back. He introduced Pauli to a young trainee analyst, a woman named Erna Rosenbaum. She would work with Pauli directly. She was junior enough, new enough to the field, that her influence on the material would be minimal. The dreams would arise in the space between Pauli and Rosenbaum, and they would be, as close as such a thing can ever be, unguided, uncontaminated. Pauli, agreed. Perhaps he was in enough pain that the details of the arrangement mattered less than the arrangement itself. Perhaps he was curious. He was, by every account, a man of enormous and sometimes inconvenient intellectual curiosity, and it is not impossible that some part of him was already beginning to look at his own interior with the same attention he gave to a tricky calculation, the same willingness to sit with an unfamiliar thing and see what it showed him. He began to record his dreams, not casually, not the way a person sometimes jots down a half-remembered image on waking. Systematically, with the precision of a man trained to observe phenomena and write them down exactly as they appeared, without editorializing, without deciding in advance what they meant. He had been doing something like that his whole career, seeing clearly, reporting accurately, letting the mathematics speak for itself. He applied the same discipline here. And what came was extraordinary. Over the months and years that followed, not just the period with Rosenbaum, but the longer arc of his engagement with Jung's world, Pauli produced a very large series of dreams and visual images. Jung, who eventually received and studied this material, said that he had over 1,000 such dreams and images to draw on. More than 1,000. A physicist's dream diary kept with scientific care, reaching into territory no physics textbook had ever charted. From that vast reserve, Jung selected roughly 400 for close study. Think about what that means. A working scientist's inner life, encoded in images, brought up from sleep night after night, carefully written down, and then another person, a psychologist trained in exactly the kind of attention this material required, going through it. Not rushing, weighing each image against the long tradition of symbolic interpretation Jung had spent his career developing, the alchemical literature, the mythology, the patterns he had seen repeated across hundreds of patients and thousands of years of human dream life. 400 dreams. Enough to fill a book. And fill a book they did. Jung published his analysis of this material in a long, dense, extraordinarily rich study called Individual Dream Symbolism in Relation to Alchemy. That essay eventually became the core, the backbone, the living spine of a book he published in 1944 called Psychology and Alchemy. It is still in print. People still read it. Scholars argue about it. It is considered one of the central texts in Jungian psychology, and for years, many years, the readers of that book had no idea. They saw the dreamer described as a young man of scientific education, later a scientist of international reputation. The phrase was careful. It was true, and it said nothing. Thousands of people read those dreams, followed those images through their strange transformations, without ever knowing that the sleeping mind they were looking into belonged to one of the men who had built quantum mechanics. That the anonymous dreamer had an exclusion principle named after him, that he had a Nobel Prize coming. The secret was kept, as these things go, reasonably well. Only later was it widely confirmed. But by then the book had done its work. By then the dreams themselves had become, in the history of psychology, almost their own kind of landmark, 400 dispatches from the unconscious of an extraordinary mind, preserved and studied and argued over, without the name attached. Take a slow breath if you like. Let that settle. Now let us look at one of those 400. Because the images Pauli produced were not all of equal weight, and there is one among them that deserves to be held up to the light and turned slowly, because it is one of the most remarkable things in this entire story. Jung called it the Great Vision. Pauli called it, or at least Jung described it this way, the world clock. In German, the Weltuhr. And it was not exactly a dream. It was something Pauli experienced between sleep and waking, a visual impression that rose in him with unusual force and stayed with him with unusual clarity. The kind of image that does not dissolve the way ordinary dreams do, that persists, that asks to be attended to. Here is what he saw. 2 circles, or 2 discs, 2 wheels, call them what you like, intersecting, not flat, but 3-dimensional, so that one disc stood upright, like a wheel you might roll, and the other lay flat, like a plate, and they crossed each other, shared a center point, their edges meeting and passing through each other with the logic of a vision rather than a machine. The vertical disc was divided in 16 parts. The horizontal disc was divided in 32. Both were turning. Both were driven or accompanied by a black bird, a dark winged figure in the image that seemed to govern the motion of the whole. And the whole mechanism, these 2 great turning circles with their different divisions and their shared centre, pulsed in 3 rhythms. Not 1, 3. A slow rhythm, a middle rhythm, a fast one, interlocked. He reported that it brought him a sensation he did not have easy words for. In the account that came to Jung, it was described as the most sublime harmony. A deep peace. Not the peace of exhaustion or of numbness, but the peace of something clicking into place. The way the last piece of a complex proof will sometimes settle and the whole structure suddenly stands still and is simply true. A hard-nosed physicist. A man trained to distrust anything he could not measure. And he saw those turning circles and the black bird between them, and he felt, for a moment, whole. Jung read this image with enormous care and attention. Everything in his years of study pointed to what it was. It was a mandala, one of the most elaborate and articulate ones he had ever encountered, produced not by a mystic or a religious seeker, but spontaneously, from the sleep edge of a physicist's exhausted mind. The 2 circles intersecting were a quaternity, a 4-fold structure, the form Jung had come to associate with the self, that deep totality he believed the psyche was always straining toward. The 3 rhythms were a kind of timekeeping, a pulse. The black bird was a figure of the psyche's own animating energy, its dark wing the unconscious component driving the whole. The image, in Jung's reading, was the psyche's own diagram of itself in the process of finding its way to wholeness. Not learned, not borrowed, not taken from any book, arising on its own from the deep interior of a man who, by any conventional measure, had no business dreaming in such symbols. That was precisely Jung's point. That was, in one image, the whole argument for the collective unconscious. Here was a man who had spent his life in the most abstract, impersonal region of modern thought, a man who worked in equations, who prided himself on exactly the kind of rigorous distance from feeling and symbol that modern science had built over 3 centuries. And his unconscious produced the weltour. This ancient pattern, circles, centre, quaternity, pulse, welling up from some stratum so deep that his training and his persona and his brilliance had not touched it, had not needed to. The archetype was older than all of that, older than quantum mechanics, older than physics itself. Jung wrote about this image at length. He took it seriously, the way you take seriously a piece of data that does not fit your previous model, and therefore tells you something your previous model could not. The feeling of sublime harmony Pauli reported, that was significant too. Not just as a subjective state, but as information. The psyche, Jung believed, registers its own approach to wholeness. The feeling is the signal. And a man who had been in acute, grinding crisis for years, a man who had been drinking and quarrelling and unable to put his life in order, that man had been handed by his own sleeping mind an image of perfect, 3-dimensional rhythmic order. And it had given him peace. Something was healing. Whatever was broken in him was beginning, slowly, to find its way back together. Now, Jung had a collaborator for the deeper alchemical work, and this is where another name belongs in the room, because the ideas that gave these dreams their interpretive home did not come from Jung alone. Marie-Louise von Franz was his close associate, a formidable scholar in her own right, and she had spent years working on the alchemical literature alongside Jung, translating and interpreting texts from the long, strange tradition that had occupied medieval and Renaissance Europe, texts that looked, on the surface, like instructions for turning lead into gold, but that Jung and von Franz read as something else entirely, as a kind of proto-psychology conducted in symbol language, as early attempts to describe the processes of the unconscious before the unconscious had a name. Von Franz translated a medieval alchemical text called the Aurora Consurgens, which means the rising dawn, and that work fed directly into the circle of thinking about symbol, transformation, and the hidden processes of the psyche that surrounded the interpretation of Pauli's dreams. The alchemy gave Jung a vocabulary. It gave him a tradition of taking interior images seriously as real and meaningful events, not mere noise. It gave him predecessors, centuries of predecessors, who had tried, in their own fumbling and frequently misunderstood way, to map the same interior country Pauli was now sending reports from. One dream at a time. This is, perhaps, part of what made Jung able to hold Pauli's material at all. Another kind of thinker might have received 1,000 dreams from a Nobel-bound physicist and known only what to do with the physics. Jung received them and had a whole library inside him already, centuries deep, full of circles and birds and wheels and central points, full of images that looked mad on the surface and carried, when you turned them carefully in the light, the shape of something true. He knew how to look at the weltour and not dismiss it. He knew, from long immersion in the alchemical tradition that von Franz was helping to bring forward, that images like this one were not accidents, were not noise, were exactly the kind of thing that serious attention was owed. So there it was, in the early 1930s. A physicist recording his dreams, a psychologist reading them with the help of a tradition that went back to the Middle Ages. a young trainee analyst holding the space in between, carefully enough that the material was arriving clean. And the dreams kept coming. It should be said, because it matters, and because it changes the shape of the story, that Pauli was not merely a specimen. He was not simply a subject. Even in those early years, the quality of his attention to his own interior life was extraordinary. He did not dream and then wait to be told what the dreams meant. He thought about them. He turned them over. He brought to the study of his own unconscious the same rigorous, hungry, slightly combative intelligence he brought to a physics problem. He argued. He questioned. He did not accept interpretations that did not seem, on examination, to hold up. And Jung, who had made a career of dealing with the full range of human minds and was not easily impressed, recognized what he was working with. This was not an ordinary analysand. This was a mind that could receive the strange material of the unconscious and think about it without either dismissing it or surrendering to it. A mind that could hold ambiguity without resolving it prematurely into either belief or disbelief. That, it turned out, was exactly the kind of mind that Jung needed. Because the questions he was beginning to formulate, questions about meaning and causation and the relationship between mind and matter, were questions that could not be resolved by psychology alone. They needed exactly the kind of disciplinary weight that only a physicist could bring. But that part of the story comes a little later. First, more dreams. First, the slow work of recovery, because that is what was happening underneath all the intellectual machinery. A man was getting better. Pauli's life began, gradually, to stabilize. The drinking grew quieter, the quarrelling settled. In 1934, he married again, a woman named Franziska Bertram, called Franca, and this marriage held. It lasted. It was stable in ways his first marriage had never been. The resolution that Pauli had been unable to find in the outer world seemed slowly to be arriving from the inside, from those 1,000 images that came up out of the dark and were carefully, patiently received. The mandala had done something, or something had done it, using the mandala as its shape. Jung would not have been surprised. He had seen it before, in other patients, the way the unconscious, when given the right kind of attention, when met with respect rather than suppression, begins to move, begins to produce images of order from its own depths. The psyche, he believed, has a drive toward wholeness as surely as water has a drive toward the sea. What analysis does, what dreams do, what the careful study of symbols does, is not impose order from outside, but create the conditions for an order that is already there, already latent, to become visible. Pauli's world clock was not something Jung had put there. It was not a symbol he had described in a lecture that Pauli had unconsciously borrowed. It arose from Pauli himself before the two men had even had the kind of direct intellectual exchange that might have produced such borrowing. That was, for Jung, a fact of considerable importance. A datum. Evidence. Not proof. He was careful about that word. He was, in his own way, as careful as Pauli about overclaiming. But evidence, yes, evidence that the patterns he had been calling archetypes were real in some sense, not invented, not personal, arising from somewhere deeper than the individual biography, the way the structure of a crystal arises from somewhere deeper than the individual atom. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath. Notice the quiet around you. Notice the weight of the night and the distance from ordinary waking concerns. Somewhere in Zurich, two great minds were beginning to find each other, and neither of them, quite yet, knew where that finding would lead. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. When you are ready, we will continue together. So, the dreams kept arriving. The analysis continued in the particular careful way Jung had structured it. And something else was happening, alongside the healing, alongside the slow stabilization of Pauli's life. The two men were beginning to talk. Not just patient and analyst, not just a study being conducted at deliberate arm's length. Something more collegial, more mutual. The physicist and the psychologist in the same city in the decade after their first encounter found each other, found that they were asking, from opposite ends of a very long room, something that might be the same question. That conversation would go on for 26 years. It would produce more than 1,300 letters. It would produce, eventually, a book with both their names on it, a physicist's essay and a psychologist's essay bound together under one cover, making a claim that neither one could have made alone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still in the early years. The dreams are still being recorded. The welter has just been seen, and the seeing of it has given a troubled, brilliant man a moment, brief and real, of the most sublime harmony. Whatever that moment was, whatever it pointed to or proved or simply was, it held something. Something worth attending to, something worth following into the dark and seeing where it led. Pauli, the most exacting mind of his generation, was following it. He did not know yet that he was not following it alone. Carl Gustav Jung had been in Zurich since 1909. He had built, by the early 1930s, a body of thought so singular that it barely resembled what most people called psychology. He called it analytical psychology, to distinguish it from Freud's work, from which he had parted, painfully and publicly, some 20 years before. What Jung had built in the years since that parting was something stranger and larger. Not a therapy exactly, though it worked as therapy. More a map of the inner world drawn from the inside. The central concept was the collective unconscious, not the personal unconscious that Freud had charted, the forgotten wishes and buried memories that belong to an individual's particular life. Something deeper than that. A layer of the psyche, Jung proposed, that is not personal at all. That is shared. That belongs to the species the way instinct belongs to the species, the way the eye belongs to creatures that evolved in light. In this deeper layer, Jung found structures he called archetypes, not images themselves, but templates for images, patterns that organize experience and throw up, in dreams and myths and the art of every culture, the same recurring figures. The wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the dark twin, the denied self. The self, with a capital letter, which Jung distinguished carefully from the ego. The ego is the small self, the one that signs your name and knows what you had for breakfast. The self is the whole thing, the totality, the archetype of wholeness itself. The mandala was one of its oldest images, the circle divided and unified, the wheel, the rose window, the compass rose. Jung had spent years noticing that patients in deep crisis or at a turning point in their inner lives began spontaneously drawing circles, symmetrical figures. four-fold patterns. Quaternity, the number 4 arranged as a cross or a square inside a circle, recurred with such regularity across cultures, across centuries, across patients who had never read a word of Eastern philosophy or medieval mysticism, that Jung treated it as a signature, a sign that the self was attempting to organize, to cohere, to center itself around a new axis. The process he called individuation, the long, difficult, not always completed movement toward wholeness, toward becoming, as fully as possible, what one actually is. Not perfection, not transcendence. Something more modest and more demanding than either of those. An honest encounter with everything inside oneself, the bright parts and the dark ones, held in a kind of creative tension until they begin to form a coherent pattern. This was the man who received Wolfgang Pauli in January 1932. And here is the thing Jung did, the thing that, in retrospect, shaped everything that followed. He did not begin analyzing Pauli himself. He referred him to a young trainee. Her name was Erna Rosenbaum. She was early in her clinical work, not yet a practicing analyst, not yet steeped in the full weight of Jung's theoretical framework. Jung chose her deliberately and for a specific reason. Pauli was a scientific mind, highly trained, attuned to the way one's expectations shape one's observations. If Jung himself sat across from Pauli and listened to his dreams, the risk was obvious. Pauli would, consciously or not, learn what Jung was looking for, and the dreams would begin, subtly, to provide it. The unconscious material would be contaminated by the theory meant to interpret it. So Jung stepped back. He arranged the distance himself, with care, because the data mattered. Because he wanted to know what Pauli's psyche would produce when it was not being watched by someone who already had a hypothesis. What it produced was extraordinary in its volume alone. Dream after dream after dream, visual impression after impression. Pauli recorded them systematically, the way a physicist records observations. Over the years that followed, the total accumulated beyond 1,000 dreams and images. 1,000. And from that vast pool, Jung selected approximately 400 for close extended study. He published his analysis. The title was Individual Dream Symbolism in Relation to Alchemy. Years later, expanded and deepened, it became the heart of a major book called Psychology and Alchemy, published in 1944. In that book, the dreamer was anonymized, described only as a young man of scientific education, a scientist of international reputation. The specific identity carefully withheld. For years, many years, readers encountered these dreams without knowing they were reading the inner life of one of the founders of quantum mechanics. Without knowing that the anonymous man, whose images of mandalas and centers and rotating figures filled those pages, had also, a few years earlier, proposed the existence of an invisible particle that would not be detected for decades. The secret was held. The dreamer was Pauli. The dreams had a particular center of gravity. They returned, again and again, to images of wholeness, of symmetry, of things in motion around a stable point, and among all of them, one stood apart. Jung called it the Great Vision. Pauli himself had given it a name. The world clock, the Welttour. What Pauli saw in this vision were two great intersecting disks, two circles sharing a common center, one running perpendicular to the other. They were set in motion. A black bird was there, bearing something or turning something, and the whole structure pulsed in 3 distinct rhythms, each one nested inside the others in a relation of perfect proportion. and it gave him a feeling he struggled to put into words, which is itself a notable thing for a man whose whole professional life was the precision of language and notation. He described it as the most sublime harmony, a deep peace, a settling of something that had been unsettled for a very long time. Jung looked at this vision and recognized the structure immediately. 2 circles, a center, a quaternity implied in the crossing, 3 rhythms as 3, the triune movement held inside the 4-fold frame, a mandala. Not a mandala Pauli had constructed, or learnt to draw, or borrowed from a book. A mandala the Psyche had generated on its own, unbidden, in the depths of a man who would have been the last to go looking for one. Jung read it as a spontaneous symbol of the self, as the Psyche's own attempt to picture its wholeness, the world clock, rising out of the unconscious of a quantum physicist, said something to Jung about the depth and universality of these patterns. They did not require belief. They did not require prior exposure to Tibetan mandalas or medieval rose windows. They arose from the inside. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked alongside Jung for decades as his closest collaborator on the alchemical material, who translated the medieval text Aurora Consurgens and became the real authority on what Jung's encounter with alchemy meant, she later wrote about this circle of work with a scholar's precision and a practitioner's intimacy. It is her careful, exacting scholarship that anchors what we know about how deeply Jung drew on alchemy to understand the symbolism arising in patients like Pauli. And alchemy, Jung had come to believe, was itself a kind of unconscious psychology. The alchemists, working in their laboratories, projecting meaning onto matter, dreaming of the transformation of base metals into gold, they were, without knowing it, describing the process of individuation. The lead that becomes gold was the ego that becomes the self. The philosopher's stone was wholeness. The work, the opus, the great work, was the inner journey wearing the costume of chemistry. This was the ground on which the 2 men would eventually meet. Not in the consulting room, not in the analyst's chair, in the territory where physics and psyche both ran out of ordinary language and found themselves reaching for something older. So let us stay with that ground for a moment. 2 men, 1 city. One the most precise mathematical mind of his generation, the other one of the most daring psychologists who had ever lived. And between them, beginning in 1932 and continuing without interruption for 26 years, a conversation that neither of them could quite have with anyone else. Take a slow breath. Let the night settle around you. What happened after the consulting room, after Erna Rosenbaum and the 1,000 Dreams and the world clock? What happened next is the part of the story almost no one tells. Because what happened next was not the end of the relationship. It was, in a real sense, the beginning of the harder and more interesting one. Pauli did not walk away from Jung's world when the analysis was complete. He walked toward it, more carefully, more critically, and with far more to offer than a series of strange and luminous images. They began to write to each other. And they did not stop. The letters collected over decades, careful, dense, sometimes impatient, sometimes genuinely tender, back and forth between 2 men who disagreed about enough to keep writing forever and agreed about enough to keep wanting to. By the time Pauli died in December of 1958, the exchange numbered more than 1,300 letters. 1,300 over 26 years. These were not casual notes. They were working documents, philosophical arguments, dream analyses, debates about the nature of number and time, and whether the word objective meant anything at all when the observer was always already part of what was being observed. Those letters were eventually gathered and published in English under the title Atom and Archetype, the Pauli/Jung letters, 1932-1958, and when you read them, when you sit with them, what strikes you first is not the mysticism, what strikes you is the rigor, the pushback, the way Pauli, again and again, would receive something from Jung and respond not with admiration, but with a question, a precise, uncomfortable physicist's question. Jung was not unaccustomed to students and followers who received his ideas with enthusiasm. Pauli was something different. Pauli received his ideas with scrutiny. He would write back asking Jung to define terms more carefully. He would point out where Jung's language had slipped from the precise into the evocative and suggest that the slippage mattered. He would offer his own analyses, his own formulations, sometimes coining words that Jung had not thought of and that turned out to be exactly right. This was not the behavior of a patient grateful for his cure. This was the behavior of a colleague. And Jung, for his part, seems to have known what he had. A theoretical physicist of the first rank, trained in the hardest discipline of the century, who had spent years examining his own unconscious with the same patience and systematic attention he brought to the behavior of electrons, that was not something you found every day. That was, in fact, something you might never find again. So they kept writing, and the letters grew stranger and more beautiful and more technically dense all at once. There is a term Pauli coined in those letters that stayed. He called it background physics. What he meant by it was this: when he paid close attention to the language appearing in his dreams, he found that the imagery kept borrowing the logical and structural patterns of physics, not the surface details, not equations or laboratories, but the deeper patterns. The way complementarity worked, the way excluded states created space for everything allowed, the way observation changed what was observed. These patterns surfaced in his dreams not as facts, but as structures, as the grammar of the night. Background physics, the physics that was already operating in the background of consciousness before any conscious thinking began. Pauli was not merely a subject reporting experience. He was a theorist interpreting it, and his interpretation brought something to the table that no purely literary or religious mind could have brought, the intuition that what appeared in symbols might have the same deep architecture as what appeared in equations. He also, in those years, wrote something called the piano lesson. It was a piece of active imagination, which, in Jung's framework, meant a practice of deliberately engaging the images arising from the unconscious, holding a conversation with them as if they were real presences, and recording what they said. Jung had developed this practice partly from his own experience during the strange, destabilizing years after his break with Freud, when the unconscious had seemed to him not a theoretical construct but a living country. He had filled notebooks with what arose, he had drawn pictures, he had built stone towers by the lake at Bollingen with his own hands. Active imagination was the name he gave to the disciplined form of what he had survived and learned from. Pauli practiced it. The piano lesson is a remarkable document. In it, Pauli imagines a conversation with a figure he calls the stranger or the alien, a feminine figure who instructs him in something like musical theory, which in the context of the piece is clearly a metaphor for the relationship between rational and irrational modes of knowing. The piano itself, with its fixed keys and its capacity for infinite variation within those constraints, becomes a kind of image of the problem Pauli was living with. the problem of form and freedom, structure and chaos, the notes that are allowed and the silences between them. He was not being analyzed anymore. He was analyzing himself, actively, in the language of symbol, because he had learned that some things could only be said that way. This is worth sitting with. One of the architects of quantum mechanics, the man who had formulated the rule that organizes all of chemistry, all of matter, the man Einstein had nominated for the Nobel Prize, was spending time in the middle of his career writing symbolic, dreamlike dialogues with interior figures. Not in private embarrassment, in genuine engagement, showing the results to Jung and asking what Jung thought. He did not find this incompatible with his physics. That is the thing that gets missed. He found it necessary to it. Because the question that had begun to obsess him, the question underneath all the letters and the dreams and the years of exchange, was not whether psychology was real. He had satisfied himself about that. The question was deeper. It was the question that quantum mechanics itself had cracked open and not yet answered. What is the relationship between the mind that observes and the world that is observed? In classical physics, this question did not really arise. The observer was irrelevant. You measured something, and it had a value, and the value was there whether or not you measured it. The physicist was a transparent window, not a participant. Quantum mechanics had ended that, quietly, precisely, and permanently. The act of observation changed what was observed. The particle did not have a definite position until someone looked. The wave function collapsed when measured. The mind, or at least the measuring apparatus, which was connected to a mind, was not outside the experiment. It was inside it. Niels Bohr, one of the founding figures of quantum mechanics, had tried to address this with the idea of complementarity. He had said, certain pairs of descriptions are mutually exclusive, but both necessary. You can describe light as a wave. You can describe light as a particle. But you cannot describe it as both at once. The two descriptions are complementary in a very specific sense. Each is complete in its domain. Each is required for a full account, and they cannot be held simultaneously in a single picture. You have to choose your angle, and the angle you choose determines what you see. Pauli had lived with complementarity as a technical concept for years, and in the course of his letters with Jung, he brought it somewhere new. He asked, what if conscious and unconscious are complementary in exactly the same rigorous sense? What if you cannot observe the contents of the unconscious directly? In the way you cannot observe a particle's position and momentum simultaneously, not because the unconscious is hiding, but because the act of conscious observation alters what it is you are trying to see. The moment you bring something to consciousness, you have changed it. The dream that you capture in waking words is already not quite the dream. The archetype that you name has already begun to harden into a concept, which is something different from an archetype. Just as the electron pinned to a position is no longer a spread-out wave, this was not a vague metaphor. Pauli was proposing a structural analogy, a genuinely rigorous one, between the epistemological situation in physics and the epistemological situation in depth psychology. And he was proposing that the analogy was not accidental, that it pointed to something real. Jung took this up, not without resistance. He was not a man who accepted ideas easily, even from Pauli. But he took it up and turned it over and found that it fit with something he had been trying to articulate for a long time. The question of what an archetype actually is. He had been using the word for decades. He had described the archetypes as inherited patterns, as the deepest structural forms of human experience, as the grammar of the psyche. But he had always been uncertain about one thing. Were they purely mental? Were they located inside the human mind, or was the human mind located inside them? Because the archetypes did not feel like constructions. They felt like discoveries. When they appeared, in dreams, in mythology, in the symbols of alchemy and religion and art across centuries and cultures, they had the quality of something encountered, not invented. The world clock had not been designed by Pauli. It had arisen. The mandala had not been constructed by the mystics of Tibet and the cathedrals of France in mutual consultation. It had appeared. Independently, as if it were already there, waiting, and if the archetypes were already there, if they were not located inside the mind, but instead the mind was, in some sense, moving through them the way a radio receiver moves through electromagnetic signals, then the boundary between psyche and matter was not where anyone had assumed. Jung sharpened this into a concept he called the psychoid archetype. Psychoid, a word meaning something like psyche-like but not quite psyche. The psychoid archetype, in his formulation, was a kind of organizing principle that operated at a level below the distinction between mental and physical. It was neither purely mind nor purely matter. It was prior to both. It ordered both. The same deep pattern that appeared as an image in a dream might also appear as a structure in the physical world, not because one caused the other, but because both were expressions of something underneath. This is subtle. It deserves saying slowly. Imagine a river and a canyon. The river and the canyon are not the same thing. The water is not the rock, but the canyon is the shape the river has made, and the river is now shaped by the canyon it made. If you look at only the water, you see one thing. If you look at only the rock, you see another. But to understand what you are actually looking at, you need to understand the relationship between them, the process that produced both. The psychoid archetype was Jung's attempt to name the process, not the water, not the rock, the shaping principle that ran through both. He and Pauli also reached back to an older term, Unus Mundus, Latin for one world. It came from the medieval alchemists, the same alchemical tradition Jung had been swimming in for years, the one that had given him the framework for understanding the symbolism in Pauli's dreams. The alchemists had believed that behind the apparent multiplicity of things, behind the different metals and elements and substances, there was a single underlying unity. One world, one substance, one reality wearing many faces. Jung and Pauli did not adopt this as a mystical belief. They adopted it as a hypothesis, a working question. What if the division between mind and matter, the division that had seemed so obvious, so necessary, so philosophically fundamental since Descartes had split the world into thinking substance and extended substance in the 17th century, what if that division was a practical convenience rather than a metaphysical truth? What if psyche and matter were two ways of describing the same underlying order, two angles of complementarity on a single reality that could never be seen whole from any one position? They did not know the answer. Neither of them pretended to. But the question had the quality of the right question. The quality of something worth 26 years of letters. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice how the night holds you, your weight in the bed, the quiet outside. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp, sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. When you are ready, we will continue together. Franca. Let us say something about Franca. Because in any honest account of these years, she is part of the story. Franziska Bertram married Wolfgang Pauli in 1934. She was known to him and to their circle simply as Franca, and the marriage, unlike the brief and disastrous first one, lasted. It was steady. It held. Whatever the analytic work had begun to accomplish, whatever rearrangement of the interior landscape had started during those years of recording dreams and sitting with Erna Rosenbaum and writing to Jung, Franca was the world it settled into. Pauli had arrived in Zurich in the wreckage of personal collapse. He had watched his mother die. He had watched a marriage dissolve in less than a year. He had been drinking in the way people drink when the alternative feels worse, and something had shifted. Slowly, the way things shift when the work is real rather than performed. Not a dramatic transformation, more like a gradual change of weather. The pressure that had been so crushing finding, over time, somewhere to go. By 1934, the worst of the crisis was behind him. Not forgotten, Pauli was not a man who forgot things, and he would continue to examine his inner life with the same unsparing attention for the rest of his career. But survivable now. Navigable, the darkness had not disappeared. He had simply found a way to live in the same house with it, without the house falling down. The letters with Jung continued, of course. They were not therapy letters by this point. They were intellectual letters, philosophical letters, letters between two people who had found in each other a rare kind of interlocutor. Someone who knew enough about what you were doing to argue with you productively. Someone whose disagreements were generative rather than simply dismissive. And they argued. That part bears repeating, because it is easy to romanticize the exchange into a story of two visionaries in perfect harmony. The truth is more interesting. Pauli thought Jung was sometimes careless with language. He pushed back on the way Jung used mathematical terms, on the way Jung treated number symbolism, on the way certain concepts were allowed to drift from precise to evocative without anyone noticing the drift. He was not hostile. He was demanding. There is a difference. Jung, for his part, was not always comfortable with Pauli's insistence on precision. He had built analytical psychology partly by insisting that the psyche was not a machine, and that understanding it required modes of knowing that were not reducible to logical analysis. The precision Pauli wanted was sometimes, in Jung's view, the wrong tool for the material. You could not pin an archetype the way you could pin an electron, or rather, you could try. But in pinning it, you changed it into something that was no longer quite what it had been. This tension was not a flaw in the exchange. It was the engine of it, because what they were trying to do was genuinely hard. They were trying to build a bridge between two disciplines that had developed entirely different languages for talking about reality, and they were trying to do it without sacrificing the integrity of either language. Pauli could not simply abandon physics and become a Jungian. Jung could not simply adopt the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics and become a physicist. What they could do was try to find the place where the deep structures of their respective languages touched, where the patterns that appeared in one also appeared in the other, not by coincidence, but because they were tracking the same underlying territory. Background physics was Pauli's name for one edge of that territory. The way physical patterns appeared in psychic life, the psychoid archetype, was Jung's name for another edge. the way psychic patterns seem to operate in physical reality. The Unus Mundus was the name they borrowed together for the territory itself, the one world that neither of them could quite see directly, that both of them kept finding evidence of from their different sides in their different languages. It was, if you want an image for it, like two explorers mapping the same mountain range from opposite valleys. Each has detailed, accurate maps of their own side. Each can see, when they compare notes, that the terrain is consistent, that the same high peaks appear in both maps, approached from different angles. They have not yet found a pass through which to walk from one side to the other, but they know the mountain is one mountain. Pauli brought something else to this project that is easy to miss. He brought his comfort with the invisible. Remember the neutrino? In December of 1930, when Pauli's personal life was already in its worst year, the year of the divorce, the year of the drinking, the year before he appeared at Jung's door, he had written his famous letter to a conference he could not attend. He had addressed it with characteristic dry wit to dear radioactive ladies and gentlemen, and he had proposed the existence of a particle that no instrument in the world could then detect. A particle with no charge, with almost no mass, capable of passing through solid matter, through the entire Earth, as if it were not there. He had proposed it because without it the numbers did not add up. Energy was being lost in beta decay, and no one could account for where it went. Pauli said, "It is going somewhere. Something is carrying it, something real, something we cannot yet see." The neutrino was not directly detected until 1956. 26 years after Pauli named it. He received that news 2 years before he died, and by all accounts it moved him. Not because he had been uncertain, he had believed in it the whole time, as certainly as he believed in anything, but because now the world agreed. A particle so subtle that it passed through matter as if matter were not there. Real but invisible, measurable only by its effects, detectable only after decades of effort. Is it any wonder this man was willing to take seriously the proposition that the unconscious mind was real? That what could not be seen directly might still be operating, leaving traces, carrying something essential through the world? He had spent 26 years being right about an invisible thing. He knew what that felt like. The dreams Pauli kept recording, long after the formal analytic work with Erna Rosenbaum had ended, were in this light a kind of data. Not the clean data of a laboratory, messier, harder to formalize, resistant to the reduction that made other kinds of data useful, but data nonetheless. Evidence of something operating below the threshold of ordinary awareness. Something with structure. Something that recurred. Something that responded, not randomly, but in patterns. He approached those patterns the way he approached any difficult problem in physics, with patience, with suspicion of easy answers, and with a willingness to sit with confusion for as long as the problem required. He would write to Jung describing a new dream. Jung would write back with an interpretation. Pauli would sometimes accept the interpretation and sometimes push back that reading feels too neat, too literary, too influenced by the theory. Show me why this and not something else. What would falsify this reading? What evidence would change your view? These were a physicist's questions, and they were the right questions. They kept the exchange honest. They kept Jung from simply confirming what he already believed by reading the dreams of a man who knew his theories. There is a word for what Pauli was doing in those letters, a word from science. He was a colleague who could provide genuine critical resistance, not the resistance of someone who simply did not understand. The resistance of someone who understood very well and still was not satisfied. Jung needed that. Whatever else he was, and he was many things, not all of them without shadow, he was honest enough to know that he needed it. His psychology was always in danger of becoming a closed system, a framework so rich and internally consistent that it could absorb almost anything without being challenged by it. A dream could always be made to confirm the theory. The archetypes could always be found wherever you looked for them. The theory needed someone who would ask, "But how do you know? How do you distinguish the pattern from the projection?" Pauli asked, every time. And in asking, he shaped what the theory became. The collaboration was not always easy. There were periods of less frequent exchange. There were topics on which they simply could not reach agreement, and eventually agreed not to fight about further. There was, in Pauli, a persistent anxiety about how the whole enterprise looked to his colleagues in physics. He was protective of the association, not secretive exactly, but careful. The collaboration was not public in the way that a joint research project at a university would be. It was private correspondence, private intellectual wrestling, private vulnerability. A Nobel laureate examining his own dreams with the tools of a psychologist was not something the physics community of the 1940s and 1950s would have found obviously respectable. And Pauli cared about respectability, not in a vain way. In the way of someone who knows that ideas need credibility to travel, and that credibility is a finite resource that can be spent in the wrong places. He had built his reputation through decades of immaculate, exacting, genuinely foundational work. He did not want it obscured by association with the wrong kind of strangeness. Not because the strangeness was wrong, but because he had not yet found the language to make it right. He was still looking for that language. That was, in the end, what the 26 years were really about. Not the confirmation of ideas either of them had already formed. The search for a language that did not yet exist. A language precise enough to satisfy a physicist, capacious enough to hold an archetype, honest enough to admit what neither discipline could yet say. They never found it. Not completely. What they found was the outline of the territory where such a language would need to live. They could describe the shape of the question even when they could not answer it. They could say, "Here is where our maps run out. Here is where something is that neither of us can fully name. Here is where we both feel the pull of the same invisible thing." The collaboration that began in January of 1932 in a psychologist's office in Zurich with a physicist in crisis and a methodological decision to send him somewhere safer, that collaboration reached across 26 years and 1,300 letters toward something neither man could see clearly, but both were convinced was there, a bridge between mind and matter, not built, not crossed, but mapped, at least in outline, by two of the most exacting minds of the 20th century, reaching toward each other across the distance between their disciplines with something very close to trust. And outside, in the city they both lived in, the lake lay still, and the mountains held the dark, and the invisible particles passed through everything without stopping, carrying their small, invisible energies through the whole weight of the world. So let us stay with the question that remained, even after all those years. The question they circled together, but never fully answered, because it is the one that brought them together in the first place, and it is the one that will take us gently to the end of tonight. The word is synchronicity. You have heard it. Most people have. It gets used loosely, and that looseness bothered Pauli enormously. It bothers most physicists when language designed to do precise work gets stretched until it means everything, which means it means nothing. So let us take care with it. Let us say exactly what Jung meant, and exactly what Pauli contributed to that meaning, and exactly what it does not mean. Because the precision matters, and because the precision is, in its own way, more beautiful than the vague version. Synchronicity, as Jung formulated it, is a meaningful coincidence between two events that have no causal connection. That is the whole of the definition, a meaningful coincidence with no causal link. Not, the universe is whispering to you. Not, everything happens for a reason in the sense that an invisible hand arranged it. Not, thought creates reality. Not any of the things that get folded into that word in popular usage. Those framings collapse the precision Jung and Pauli worked so hard to maintain, and they replace a genuine intellectual proposal with something softer and, in the end, less honest. The word Jung was reaching for was acausal, without cause. And the reason Pauli could help him think clearly about that word was that Pauli lived in a world where a causality was already a fact. Take a single radioactive atom. A single atom of, say, uranium, it will decay. It will emit a particle and become a different atom. This is certain. But when it will do this, the exact moment cannot be predicted. Not because we lack the instruments, not because our measurements are imprecise, because, according to quantum mechanics, there is no fact of the matter in advance. The decay happens when it happens. It is not caused by any prior event you could in principle identify and point to. The atom does not wait for a signal. Nothing pushes it. It simply, at some moment, changes. This is a causality. Real, mathematical, experimentally verified a causality built into the fabric of matter itself. Pauli spent his professional life inside this world. He knew it not as a philosophical curiosity, but as the bedrock of his discipline. And when Jung came to him with the idea that some coincidences might be meaningful without being caused, Pauli did not laugh. He recognized the shape of the argument. He had been living in a version of it for years. The connection was not that quantum physics explains synchronicity, or that quantum mechanics proves the soul, or any of the enthusiastic leaps that later writers would make. Pauli himself was careful to warn against those leaps. The connection was subtler and more rigorous. It was that physics had already established that the world contains at least one domain where causality breaks down at the most fundamental level. If matter could behave acausally, then the proposal that meaningful coincidence might sometimes arise acausally was, at minimum, not physically absurd. It did not violate what physics knew. That was the opening. That was what Pauli's mind gave to Jung's idea. Not proof, not confirmation, permission to take the question seriously. A rest here, if you like. Let the room be quiet for a moment. Let whatever thoughts are moving through you slow down just a little. You do not need to hold any of this. You do not need to remember it. Just let it settle like dust in still air. When you are ready, we will go on. The joint publication came in 1952. 20 years after Pauli had first walked into Jung's circle. 20 years of letters, of dreams, of arguments, of the slow accumulation of something neither man could have built alone. The book was called, in German, Naturerklärung und Psyche. In English, it has been translated as The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. 2 essays, bound together under one cover. That pairing was the statement. The book itself was the argument. Here are 2 disciplines, it said. Here are 2 of the most careful thinkers in those disciplines. They are publishing side by side because they believe they are working on the same problem from 2 different directions. Jung's essay was the one that named the concept. Synchronicity, and Acausal Connecting Principle. He had been developing the idea for decades, but this was the formal statement. Carefully hedged, carefully limited. He was not claiming that all coincidences are meaningful. He was not claiming to have explained the mechanism. He was proposing that a class of experiences in which an outer event and an inner state correspond in a way that feels profoundly meaningful, without any detectable causal link between them, deserved a category of their own. A name, a place in serious inquiry rather than in superstition or in dismissal. He called the principle acausal because he refused to invoke hidden causes that could not be demonstrated. He called it connecting because the experience of synchronicity always involves a felt correspondence, a sense that two things belong together even though nothing connected them in the usual way. The Golden Scarab is the story he told most often to illustrate this. It was not about Pauli. This is worth saying clearly, because the two stories sometimes get mixed together in the retelling. The Golden Scarab belonged to Jung's clinical practice, to a different patient at a different time. But it belongs to this evening because it is the clearest image of what synchronicity actually means in lived experience, and because it is the story Jung himself reached for when he wanted to make the abstract concrete. A woman came to Jung. She was intelligent, trained in a certain manner of thought, a manner Jung described as somewhat rigid, somewhat rationalist, a little sealed against the unexpected. She was telling him a dream she had had. In the dream, she had been given a piece of jewellery, a golden scarab, a beetle, the kind the ancient Egyptians had used as a symbol of transformation and renewal. As she described this dream, something tapped at the window behind Jung. He got up, he opened the window. A small beetle flew in. It was a rose chafer, in Latin, Setonia aurata, a beetle with a greenish-gold shimmer, the closest thing, in the cool climate of Switzerland, to an Egyptian golden scarab. He caught it gently and held it out to her. "Here is your scarab," he said. She was, as he put it, sufficiently unsettled that something gave way in her. The sealed manner opened slightly. Something that had been resistant yielded. Nothing caused the beetle to arrive at that window at that moment. No hidden mechanism connected her dream to the insect's flight. The patient dreaming of a golden scarab did not somehow summon the beetle. That is not what Jung was claiming. What he was pointing to was the quality of meaning the coincidence carried. The inner image and the outer event corresponded in a way that felt significant. The correspondence was real, even if the causation was absent. That is synchronicity. It is a description of an experience, not an explanation of its mechanism. Jung was too careful to claim the mechanism. Pauli was too rigorous to let him. What they agreed on was that the experience itself was real, was not pathological, was not simply wishful thinking, and deserved to be taken seriously by any honest inquiry into how mind and world actually relate. Now to the essay Pauli wrote. The one that sat beside Jung's in the 1952 volume. It is, in some ways, the more surprising piece, because it does not look, at first glance, like it has anything to do with synchronicity or dreams or the mind. It is about a historical dispute between two 17th-century thinkers, Johannes Kepler and a man named Robert Fludd. Let us sit with them for a moment, because Pauli chose them carefully. Johannes Kepler, you may know, at least by name, the mathematician and astronomer who worked out the laws of planetary motion, who gave us the mathematical shapes of the orbits, the ellipses, the relationships between a planet's speed and its distance from the sun. A rigorous mathematical mind. a mind that worked in numbers and geometrical relationships and prided itself on quantitative precision. Robert Fludd is less famous now, but in the early 17th century he was prominent, a physician, an alchemist, a thinker in what we might call the symbolic tradition. Where Kepler saw the world in numbers and measurable ratios, Fludd saw it in symbols, in correspondences, in a system of meaning in which the universe was a vast living whole, every part reflecting every other part. And the way to understand it was through symbolic reading rather than through measurement. Kepler and Fludd argued. In print, in the way scholars argued in the 17th century, which could be quite fierce. And the argument was essentially about this. Which approach gives you real knowledge of the world? Measurement or symbol, the mathematical and the quantitative, or the imaginative and the correspondential? Kepler thought Fludd's approach was not knowledge at all. He thought it was picture thinking, dressed up intuition, not rigorous enough to count as understanding. Fludd thought Kepler was reducing the living wholeness of the world to dead number, stripping out the meaning to keep only the measurable skeleton. What Pauli saw in this historical argument, and this is the physicist's real contribution to the 1952 volume, was that both men were right, and both men were wrong. And the fight between them was not settled in the 17th century. It was still going on in 1952. It is still going on now. Pauli's point was this. Every scientist, even the most purely mathematical, comes to the work with something that is not itself mathematical, with images, with intuitions, with what he called, in a phrase he was careful about, archetypal ideas, pre-formed shapes of thought that guide the questions a scientist thinks to ask before any data arrives. Kepler's own work was saturated with the image of the Trinity, with the idea that the world must be threefold because God is threefold. That was not a mathematical derivation. That was a symbol at work inside a supposedly purely rational mind. And Fludd's symbolic system had its own rigour, its own internal coherence, even if it could not be measured. It was not simply wrong. It was answering a different question. Pauli was not saying science should abandon mathematics and become alchemy. He was saying something subtler. He was saying that the clean separation between the mathematical quantitative and the symbolic meaningful is itself a historical artifact, a wound inflicted when the two modes of understanding split apart in the 17th century. And that wound had never healed. Physics had grown enormously powerful on one side of that split. But it had left something behind. And the thing it left behind did not cease to exist simply because physics stopped looking at it. His essay was a physicist's argument for the integrity of the question Jung had spent his life trying to answer. The two essays together said, here is the same wound, seen from two sides, from psychology and from physics, from the inside of the human mind and from the inside of the natural world. And the question of whether those two sides might be aspects of a single undivided thing, that question is serious. It has not been answered. It should not be abandoned. That was what the 1952 book said to anyone willing to read it carefully. The bridge. They called it sometimes the Unus Mundus, the one world. The notion that beneath the apparent separateness of mind and matter, beneath the division between what is inside us and what is outside us, there might be a single underlying reality of which both are expressions. Not that mind is matter, not that matter is mind, not that one reduces to the other. Something harder to say than that they are both faces of something for which we do not yet have the right word. Jung had a technical name for the point at which the psychological and the physical seemed to touch. He called it the psychoid archetype, an archetype that is not purely mental, not a thought, not a symbol, not an image in any ordinary sense, but also not a physical object, something that belongs to the boundary, that operates in both domains at once, that orders both an inner experience and an outer event without being fully contained in either. This is where the language strained most. Pauli knew it. He pressed Jung on it repeatedly in the letters. What exactly do you mean by psychoid? Where precisely does the psyche end and matter begin? What is the mechanism? Even if the mechanism is not causal, what is the process? These were a physicist's questions, demanding a precision that psychology did not yet have the tools to supply. Jung answered as honestly as he could. He said, "I do not know the mechanism. I can describe the territory. I can say that in certain experiences, synchronistic experiences, numinous experiences, experiences of deep symbolic meaning arriving from an unexpected direction, the inner and the outer seem to correspond in a way that is not accounted for by any causal chain we can identify. That is real. I do not know what it means at the deepest level. I am trying to find the right question before claiming to have found the answer." Pauli accepted this, reluctantly, as the honest position of a careful thinker at the edge of what could currently be known. They were two cartographers of a territory neither could fully enter. Let us pause again here, very gently. Notice where you are, the surface beneath you, the weight of your body resting into it. Notice whatever sounds are in the room or just outside it. The small, ordinary sounds of the world going on around a person at rest. You do not need to understand any of this. You do not need to hold it. What matters is only what, if anything, has touched you in the telling. Let that stay. Let the rest drift. And when you are ready, we will come to the end of tonight's story. In the autumn of 1958, Pauli was in Princeton. He had been invited, as many of the great physicists had been, to spend time at the Institute for Advanced Study there. The Institute was the kind of place that accumulated minds the way certain rivers accumulate gold, quietly, over time, drawing the most concentrated intelligence of an era to a relatively unremarkable campus in New Jersey. Einstein had been there. Gödel had been there. Pauli was there, and he was not well. He had been experiencing pain, something in his side. He ignored it for a time, in the way that driven people often ignore the body's signals until the body makes ignoring impossible. When it became impossible, he flew back to Zurich, to the city where he had lived and worked for 30 years, where the lake was, and the mountains beyond it, and the Earth where he had taught theoretical physics since 1928, where Jung's house stood, where the letters had been written and the conversations had happened, and the strange, slow collaboration had unfolded across more years than most friendships last. He was admitted to the Rotkreuz Hospital, in German, the Red Cross Hospital, a hospital in Zurich. He was taken to a room. The room was number 137. A colleague came to see him and noticed the number on the door. This colleague knew, as anyone close to Pauli knew, what 137 meant to the physicist who was lying in that room. Let us say what it meant. The fine structure constant. This is a number that appears in physics, a dimensionless number, which means it is not a measurement in any unit, not meters or seconds or kilograms. It is a pure number, a ratio, a relationship between fundamental constants of nature. It governs the strength of the electromagnetic force, the way charged particles interact, the way atoms hold together, the way light and matter exchange energy. It is roughly equal to 1 divided by 137. It is, in some ways, the number that underlies the shape of the visible world. And no one knows why it has that value. You might think that an odd thing to say. Physics explains a great deal, but the fine structure constant is one of those numbers the universe simply seems to have chosen. Without any derivation we have found that would tell us why it had to be that number rather than another. Change it slightly, and the universe would look radically different. Atoms would not hold together the same way. Stars would burn differently, or not at all. The chemistry that produces life would not be available. The number seems almost impossibly well chosen for the existence of complexity. And yet physics cannot, from first principles, explain why it is what it is. Pauli was obsessed with it. He spoke about it the way some people speak about the deepest riddles of existence, which, for a physicist, it was. It has been reported by those who knew him that if he could ask God one question, he would ask, why 137? Not the nature of good and evil, not the meaning of suffering, not any of the questions that occupy most of us at the edges of our understanding. The number, the specific, particular, fundamental number that underlies the structure of the world. That was the shape of his mind. And now he was lying in room 137. He died there on the 15th of December, 1958. He was 58 years old. When his colleague recognized the room number, and when that recognition spread among the people who had known him, there was a quality to the moment that is difficult to describe without either overclaiming or dismissing it. The number that had occupied Pauli's deepest curiosity, the number he associated with the most beautiful and troubling mystery he knew, was the number of the room where he met his end. Was it synchronicity? Let us be as careful as Pauli himself would have wanted us to be. There is no causal connection. The hospital did not know what 137 meant to him. The room was simply the room that was available. And yet, the coincidence carries a quality of meaning that is impossible to deny, and impossible to prove, and somehow impossible to dismiss. It is exactly the kind of event Jung's essay had tried to name. An outer fact and an inner significance arriving together with no causal bridge between them. Whether it means something in the deepest sense of that word, the sense that involves a universe that cares about meaning, no one can say. Jung would not have said that it proves anything. Pauli himself, one imagines, would have looked at that door number and felt something he could not have put in an equation, would have been aware of the irony, and the beauty, and the strangeness. He had spent his professional life working with things that could not be directly seen. The neutrino, which he proposed in 1930 and which was not detected until 1956, 2 years before he died. He had spent 26 years working with Jung on things that could not be directly measured. The archetype, the meaningful coincidence, the possible unity behind the apparent division of mind and matter. He believed in the real existence of things that were invisible and undetected, and in room 137 in a Zurich hospital in December of 1958, he came to the end of the search. Jung outlived him. Jung died in 1961. He had spent the years after Pauli's death continuing to think about the questions they had opened together. He worked with Marie-Louise von Franz on the alchemical material. He returned, in his last years, to the great round mystery of the Unus Mundus, the one world. The possibility that what we call mind and what we call matter are like the two sides of a coin, real, distinguishable but inseparable, and ultimately one surface. He never finished it. Neither did Pauli. What they finished was a chapter in the long, slow, collaborative effort of human beings to understand what we are and what the world is. They advanced the question. They gave it a precision it had not had before. They gave it a name, synchronicity. And that name, imperfectly understood as it often is, has carried the question forward into conversations and lives and moments of quiet wonder that neither of them could have imagined. And perhaps that is enough to do. To advance a question. To name something that was there before the naming but could not be thought clearly until someone had found the word. To sit across from someone whose discipline is entirely different from yours and say, I think we are looking at the same thing. I cannot see it from where I stand. You cannot see it from where you stand. But between us, mapping the outline from both sides, we might find the shape of it. That is what they did. For 26 years. For 1,300 letters. For one joint book published in 1952, a physicist and a psychologist, and 2 essays, and 1 argument held together under a single cover. And somewhere in that argument is a truth about the way knowledge actually works. Not in isolation, not in the clean separation of disciplines, not by insisting that only one language can describe what is real, but across the boundary. In the difficult, uncomfortable, intellectually demanding work of 2 minds reaching toward each other from opposite sides of a river neither can cross alone. You have been listening to a long story tonight, a story about a man who built some of the foundations of modern physics and then found himself in a personal winter of grief and dissolution, walking into the one place that felt capable of holding what his equations could not. A story about the psychologist who met him there and had the unusual wisdom not to handle him too directly, but to send him somewhere quieter and let the dreams come on their own. A story about the slow, serious, exacting work that followed, the 1,000 dreams, the 400 selected, the book published with a name that was not his name, the world clock turning in its 3 rhythms and bringing to one of the coldest minds of the century the feeling of sublime harmony. A story about a number, 1 divided by 137, that haunted a physicist from the inside of his discipline, and a room in a hospital in Zurich that wore that number on its door. You do not need to have understood all of it. You do not need to carry any of it forward into tomorrow. If one image has stayed with you, the 2 discs turning, the black bird at the center, the beetle at the window, the door with its number, let that be the one. Let everything else settle gently into the quiet that sleep brings. There is something in this story worth resting with, though, something that has nothing to do with physics or with psychology in any technical sense. It is this. 2 people, each at the edge of what their own way of knowing could tell them, chose to trust the edge. They did not pretend the edge was not there. They did not retreat to the center of what was already known and stay safe inside it. They went, carefully and rigorously and honestly, to the place where the maps ran out, and they stood there together, pointing at the territory that lay beyond the last marked line. Most of us do not do this alone very well. It is frightening to stand at the edge of what you understand and admit that you cannot see clearly from here. It is harder still to trust another person who speaks a different language, who works from different assumptions, who asks different questions. But Pauli trusted Jung with his dreams. Jung trusted Pauli to keep him honest. They held each other to a standard of seriousness that neither might have maintained alone. That is what real collaboration looks like when it is working at its best. Not agreement, not the comfortable sharing of existing certainties, something more demanding and more generous than that. The willingness to say, I do not know, but I think we are both pointing at the same thing. And I trust your pointing, even when I cannot follow your hand. Wherever you are tonight, whatever you are carrying, the thing you have not been able to explain to anyone, the coincidence that felt too meaningful to dismiss and too strange to claim out loud, the sense that your own inner life and the outer world sometimes seem to be reading from the same page, those experiences have a long and serious pedigree. They were taken seriously by a physicist who formulated the exclusion principle and won the Nobel Prize. They were taken seriously by a psychologist who spent 50 years mapping the interior of the human mind. Together, those two men looked at the edge of what could be known and did not look away. That is not a small thing. Neither is what you carry. Sleep now. The lake is still. The mountains hold the dark. The invisible particles are passing through everything, through the walls, through the blankets, through you, right now, without pause and without difficulty, carrying their small energies through the whole weight of the world. And somewhere in room 137 in a hospital in Zurich in December of 1958, a great mind came to its rest, and the number on the door meant nothing, and the number on the door meant everything, and no one living can tell you which is true. That is enough to hold, very lightly, as you fall asleep. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.